Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Japanese Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to you all, as always, to these Japanese race ratings. This series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances, seeing how well everyone's done in what was a pretty tricky race this time round. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy it and subscribe down below for more F1 content. Now, with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Starting off with the result, and it is Max Verstappen, P1 World Champion, after a little bit of confusion after the end of the race, but it is Verstappen who takes the win and the championship, just where Red Bull wanted to. Honda's home race in Japan, great result for him and the team. In second, his teammate Perez, who arguably forced Leclerc to have his error into the final corner on the final lap, which then ultimately gave Verstappen the title. And obviously that means Leclerc was then in third place, even though he crossed the line in second, picked up a 5-second penalty. In behind him, Esteban Ocon, great defence for that entire wet stint, keeping Lewis Hamilton behind the entire time, placing his car perfectly. Obviously then in behind Lewis Hamilton, just couldn't make his way past Esteban Ocon, stuck behind the Alpine the whole time. And in behind him, Sebastian Vettel, a great result for the Aston Martin driver, taking full advantage of the pit stops, changing from wets to inters, and just beating out Fernando Alonso, who was inches away from 6th place, and I mean inches. If you haven't seen the replay, go have a look. Then in behind them, 8th place George Russell, a bit of a fight for him the entire race. Started further back, lost some places in pit stops, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then P9, maybe the biggest shock of all, Nicholas Latifi. I did not expect him to be making the results page this year, but there he is. And then Lando Norris rounding out the top 10 for McLaren, not the best day for them. On to the race itself, and it was chaotic to say the least. You know, you had Verstappen and Leclerc, turn 1. Leclerc getting a pretty good start, getting alongside, and actually just a little bit ahead of Verstappen. But then Max just throwing it round the outside, making it stick, keeping first place into the first turn. In behind them, Sebastian Vettel couldn't see a thing if you haven't seen the onboard. It was so difficult to see anything. Made contact with Fernando Alonso. That put him into the gravel, but he managed to steer it back to the track and keep going. And considering that he finished in P6, he's done really well. Then you have a bit later on in the lap, Alonso making a move on Hamilton. Couldn't quite make it stick. Lewis kind of getting the switchback. And up ahead of them, Carlos Sainz, the big incident, losing it on his own, just aquaplaning off, crashing into the barriers. His car in a bit of a scary situation, actually. If you see the replay from his, all the others just flying past, dislodged a bit of the advertising boards as well that got stuck on Pierre Gasly's car. And talking of Pierre Gasly, obviously we have to talk about the sort of tractor incident, the vehicle on the track. And the way I see it is like this. First off, that vehicle should never have been there. The cars weren't all grouped together. They hadn't red flagged it by the time that they brought it on the track. The cars weren't together under the safety car even. So definitely that's on the FIA. That vehicle should never have been on the track. We don't need to go into it too much, but obviously Jules Bianchi sadly died back in 2014, 2015, and we never wanted to see anything like it or potentially like it again. However, I will add that Gasly on board definitely was going a bit quicker than he should have been. And so while, as I said, it's definitely on the FIA, that tractor should never have been there, Gasly going to quickly just sort of escalated the situation a bit more, and he did get a penalty for it. But on the whole, that's on the FIA. That situation should never have been there in the first place. After that though, that red flag that I just mentioned, and a 2-hour-long wait until we got going again with just about 40 minutes to go. Everyone having to start on the wet tyres because it was sort of behind the safety car, but people very quickly switching onto the inters, and we saw some big gainers such as Sebastian Vettel, who jumped from right near the back up into 6th place. A couple of cars decided to stay out on the wets, Mick Schumacher and Joe, and I feel sad for Mick really. You know, he was up there in, I think, the lead, maybe P2 or something like that for a little bit, and then just got eaten up by everyone behind and pitted and came out right near the back. However, what we did see was a load of battles throughout that entire time on the wet track, which we didn't really expect to see, but it was really good. It was some good racing actually. Not the best of the year, but definitely up there. It's enjoyable to watch. Obviously, you had Ocon defending the entire time. That was really good to see, just placing his car perfectly to keep Lewis behind. Then a little bit later on, Fernando Alonso and the other Alpine gambling for a new set of intermediate tyres, and he was sort of like 3, 4, 5 seconds a lap quicker than those around him. almost catching Vettel at the line. Up ahead then you had Perez catching Leclerc, who had dropped off from Max, who had just driven off into the distance, with Leclerc eventually making that final mistake, cutting the corner, coming back on, sort of squeezing Perez off, very quickly getting a very obvious and deserved 5-second penalty, which then made Max Verstappen the world champion, having won the race. And with Verstappen winning the race, I do feel a little bit sorry for him in the sense of, it's a bit anticlimactic the way in which he's won his title. You saw him in the cool-down room afterwards, was sort of like, have I won it? Are you sure? Are you sure I've won it? He didn't really know. But either way, I'm pretty sure he'll be glad to have sealed the deal, especially in Japan. Would have been nice for a sort of more spectacular finish to it all. But oh well, they'll still take the win in the championship, no doubt. On to the ratings then, and starting with the fan poll from the YouTube channel, and you guys have given it a 5.7 for this one. Our first race back in Suzuka since 2019 was the last one. 5.7, I guess I can understand, it's a bit frustrating waiting so long and not really seeing much action, only sort of 45 minutes total. However, when I look at it and what I would give the race, I think I'm going to go with a 6.5. It's a little bit higher up, but the way I kind of see it is that late action was like an 8.5, and then earlier on I'd say it's a 4, and so meeting somewhere in the middle, it's that 6.5 range. And obviously, the weather plays a big part. It's an outdoor sport. Sometimes those kind of things happen, so you can't really blame the race as much, but also I am partly blaming that as well for detracting on its rating. On the whole, though, I was glad that we did get some action in the end. It would have been a shame, as I said, to wait for years since 2019 and not get a proper race in. I mean, we didn't get a proper race in, but at least we got some racing. On to teams then, and first up, it's Alfa Romeo, who actually showed some pretty decent pace in practice and qualifying, getting into Q2 with both cars, but then come race time just didn't quite click in it, and I think they'll be a bit disappointed to not come away with anything in this one. So then, Valtteri Bottas at the Japanese Grand Prix, and to start off with, even though he started up in I think it was sort of 12th place, he actually managed to lose places off the start, even though the likes of Sainz had crashed and others around him had incidents, so that's not too great. Obviously then the big delay, and afterwards when we got going everyone on the wets, when everyone changed to the inters, they were a little slow to react. You had Latifi and Vettel coming in before them, so he lost a couple of places that way. However, once on the intermediate tyres, it wasn't too great. He actually got overtaken by Magnussen. He couldn't get past the likes of, I think Norris was ahead of him at one point, and then Stroll was ahead of him. And overall, the race pace just didn't look too great. So for Valtteri, when I combine that with the not great start, considering where everyone else was, and that not great race pace later on, I think it's going to have to be a 4. On the whole, just not the best of races. He's not really done too much, just seeming quite below average. So then, Zhou Guanyu and his Japanese Grand Prix. Like his teammates, started fairly decently, up in 14th place. However, didn't have the best opening lap in those tricky conditions, lost a couple of places and then spun by himself at the hairpin, which allowed the likes of Latifi and others behind him to get past, and so he rejoined effectively last of those still running, minus Pierre Gasly. So that wasn't too great of a start. However, once we got going again, it was all down to the team. They left him out on the wet tyres for as long as possible, hoping for a safety car, which meant he then pitted later for intermediates. But on those intermediates, actually ran really well. He was sort of 6 or 7 seconds behind Gasly, but eventually caught up to the Frenchman, who was the car behind Bottas at the time, and is actually the driver that set the fastest lap of the race. So for a rating for him, it's kind of tricky because you had not a great start, obviously a bad opening lap and the spin, but then his race pace was definitely better than Valtteri. So for a rating, I'm going to give him a 4 as well. The way I see it, he's had a mistake, but also his race pace was much better than his teammate, so the grades kind of equal out. Next up, we have Haas, who actually at one point had their cars running 10th and 12th place, but like Alfa Romeo, who I've just gone over, they also came away with no points, which will have to go down as a disappointment. Kevin Magnussen then, and for him in Japan, it was a fairly decent race, I'd say. He started off actually really well and gained 5 positions on the opening lap or two. Before all that safety car and red flag came out, we saw some great moves up the inside of a couple of cars. I can't remember what the names are, but it's those turns after Dunlop, those 2 right-handers, a couple of moves into there. So that gained him some places early on, up into about 12th place. Then we had the break, and when we resumed, we saw him making moves again. He got past the likes of Valtteri Bottas with a nice move, and a couple others as well. However, then the pace sort of started to fade a little bit, and he did kind of start dropping back, and actually in the last 5 minutes, lost a couple of places, maybe just a case of pushing those tyres a bit too hard too early. We saw the pace really drop off for a lot of people. So rating-wise for Magnussen, I'd say on the whole, it's a pretty solid race. He's made a number of overtakes, he's up a good number of positions from where he started, so I think I'm going to give him probably a 6.5, only down a little bit from say a 7 because he did lose a few places a little bit later on. And now on to Mick Schumacher and his performance. Like his teammate, actually was up 5 positions on the opening lap. I didn't quite see how those happened, but to get 5 positions in a chaotic race and keep it clean as well, that's got to go down as a pretty good start. Then we have the red flag delay, and when we restart, he's actually in 10th place. Everyone on the wet tyres, and Haas decided to just keep him out there for as long as possible. Which did mean for maybe about 20 metres he was actually leading the race. However, keeping out on those wet tyres, just hoping for a safety car, and when that didn't come they had to bring him for intermediates, he was just so far off the back of the pack that nothing was ever going to go well for him. And then those at the back of the pack who elected to stop for another set of inters late on overtook him, and he eventually finished way down in 17th place. So for Mick, the way I see it is it's a good start, however all of the rest afterwards, the strategy, that's on the team. So for a rating, it's going to be a 6.5, the things he can control, he's done well, and ultimately the team have kind of just left him out to dry with the strategy. So then next up Alphatauri and the third team with no points from this one, and for them it's probably going to be a little bit frustrating considering they have the Honda tyres and Honda was back on the car and it would have been nice for them to achieve something at that race. On to Gasly's Japanese Grand Prix, and he actually started from the pit lane considering that he qualified down in I think it was 17th place. Now that meant he was at the back of everything for all those lap 1 incidents, except he very unfortunately got caught up in the debris or the advertising boardings from Carlos Sainz's crash, which forced him to pit, and then obviously led to the vehicle on track incident. I've talked about that at the beginning, so if you want to have a re-listen, feel free to go over that. I will say though, he did get a 20-second penalty for speeding, which he definitely was. As I've said, the tractor's the FIA's fault, it shouldn't have been there in the first place, but Gasly was definitely speeding under double wave yellows or the red flag conditions. Once we got going again, he was at the back of the pack and was a little late to come in for intermediate tyres, which meant that he was sort of confined to the back. He did catch up to the likes of Valtteri Bottas ahead, however didn't make too much progress and had to then pit for another set of intermediates and ended up finishing right at the back of the pack. Rating wise, it's going to be a 3.5 when you consider it's a pretty unnecessary penalty to be taking, however a lot of the strategy at the end and sitting at the back of the pack wasn't really his fault. Now Yuki Tsunoda in his home Grand Prix, Japanese Grand Prix 2022. So for Yuki it was a pretty decent start actually, he was up 4 places, up from 13th, and actually found himself in 9th place in the top 10. Then, after the delay with the red flag, got going again and lost out to the likes of, George Russell and I think Lando Norris. The strategy they went for meant that he elected to pit again for another set of intermediate tyres, and on those intermediates did get past the likes of Kevin Magnussen, Valtteri Bottas, and I think Mick Schumacher as well, and then couldn't get any more progress because he was sort of 7 seconds behind the next car. So for Yuki, I would say actually he's had a good start, then made good progress later on, admittedly on fresher tyres, but on the whole it's a pretty solid race with no mistakes in very treacherous conditions. So rating wise for Yuki, I think it's either going to be a 6.5 or a 7, but I think I'm going to go with a 6.5 simply because those overtakes later on are done using a fresher set of intermediate tyres, whereas those cars around him would have been on a bit more worn ones and slower tyres and slower cars in general. However, you've still got to make those moves stick. Next up we have Mclaren, who unfortunately for them have only picked up 1 point in this one, which is quite a big blow when you consider how close they are with their rivals Alpine for that 4th place position in the Constructors. With drivers, Norris's Japanese Grand Prix, and to start off with, it wasn't great. He lost 4 places on the opening lap or so, which meant that instead of being sort of in the edges of the top 10, he was down in 14th when we got going again. However, I will say that once we got going, the team called him in at a good time and he gained a couple of places and then made a good overtake on Mick Schumacher, getting himself back up into the top 10. However, at this point he was behind Nicholas Latifi, and when you look at the timings, not only did he not close up to Latifi, but he actually started to slip back a little bit, sort of from 1 second to around 3 or 4 by the end of the race. So when you consider that he's not had a great start and then hasn't been on the pace of Nicholas Latifi in the Williams, it's not the best of races. So for Lando for this one, I think the rating I'm going to go with is a 4. Unfortunately, the pace just didn't quite seem to be there. Maybe it was more the McLaren than him, but still, losing 4 places early on and slower than Latifi, it can't be a great grade. For Daniel Ricciardo then for Japan, and it was actually a pretty good start, up from 11th into P8, so into the top 10 early on, avoiding all the chaos and carnage around him. Then when we got going again, the team actually elected to keep him out for quite a while on the wet tyres. I think he was actually like the third last to pit for the intermediates, behind the likes of, say, Fernando Alonso or Mick Schumacher, maybe Joe, so maybe third or fourth, somewhere around there. And that did cost him a few places, which meant that although he came out further back with fresher intermediates, he could never really make those places up and only really gained them back through the likes of Stroll and others around him, pitting for a second set of intermediates and not quite making up the time. However, when you consider that pace-wise he wasn't too far off Lando when they were sort of next to each other on track, albeit 5 seconds apart, and combine that with gaining a few places at the beginning of the race, considering there's not a whole ton of race time to go on, it's not bad. So rating-wise for Ricciardo, I think I'm going to go with a 6. It's a fairly decently middling score, maybe just above average, and I think that's about right for him. Next up we have Williams, and they've come away with points, which for a team like Williams who are sat dead last in the Constructors, that has to be the goal, and it's not just 1 point but 2 points as well, and who'd have thought, courtesy of Nicholas Latifi. Driver-wise, it's Albon, and for his Japanese Grand Prix, it was a fairly quick one, over and done in maybe half a lap. Sounded like a gearbox issue, at least that was the talk on commentary, definitely some sort of mechanical failure, and he pulled over right at the beginning just after the hairpin, no further than halfway through lap 1. So rating-wise for Albon, it's going to be a not applicable. He's not really had any time either at the start of the race or later on in the race to really do anything, and the failure is not through his fault. I will say it was a shame to not be able to see him, considering that, Latifi was up there in P9 at the end, so maybe Albon could have done even better, or even, Williams could have scored 2 sets of points in this one. So then Nicholas Latifi in the Japanese Grand Prix, and to start off with, it was pretty good, going from 19th place, would have been 20th, but Gasly started from the pit lane, up into about 15th place. Admittedly, those were Carlos Sainz going out of the race, Zhou Guanyu spinning, and then Vettel having a spin at turn 1. But they don't ask how, they ask how many, and in terms of places, he was up about 4. Then later on, where it really worked out well for him was the team called him in early for the intermediate tyres, meaning he got the jump on like 5-6 cars around him and found himself in the top 10. Was overtaken by faster cars, the likes of George Russell later on, that's kind of to be expected. But when you consider it's Nicholas Latifi getting 2 points, not just 1, but 2 points in the Williams car, it's got to go down as a good race for him. So rating-wise, he's made up places at the start, and he's held people off. He was faster than Lando Norris, who I've discussed previously, so I've got to say it's probably an 8 for him. It's a great result, and the pace wasn't bad. Next up, Aston Martin, and in their fight with now Alphatauri and Haas for that 7th place in the Constructors, potentially 6th with Alfa Romeo, to pick up more good points with Sebastian Vettel in 6th is a great result for the team. So for drivers, it's Stroll in his Japanese Grand Prix, and actually gained the most places out of anyone at the start, was up 7 places. Admittedly, did start down in 18th place, so some of the other cars around him like Sainz and Sebastian Vettel and Alex Albon would have been out of it, which gave him 3 places. However, they all count just the same. So that was him elevated up into about 12th place, which meant that when we restarted again, he was in a good position. Went fairly well on his intermediate tyres, however the team did stop him for a second set, and he was dropped back down to 16th place, where he overtook the likes of Mick Schumacher, Valtteri Bottas, Kevin Magnussen and I think Yuki Tsunoda to get back up into 12th place. So when I consider Stroll's race as a whole, he's gained 7 places on the opening lap, and then kind of made that 2 intermediate tyre strategy work, getting back from 16th up to 12th. So for his race as a rating as a whole, I think it's probably going to be like a 7.5. Obviously, there's not a ton of time to go on, but in the time he's had, he's gained 7 places, and then gained even more, admittedly on fresher tyres, but still, I think he's driven really well in this one. Now, Sebastian Vettel and his Japanese Grand Prix. Didn't start off too great, he got a good start but then got alongside Fernando Alonso, and I will say kind of turned to the right. Admittedly, you cannot see a thing, so I don't think he knew it was there, but that little bit of movement had some contact and he spun into the gravel. Did do really well to keep his car out of the wall and get it back onto the track, and then once the red flag came out, he was back up to the back of the pack. Then, when we restarted, did really well with the team to come in for the intermediates early, which jumped him so many places, up into around like 6th place, which was where he finished. And that whole time, he's defending from people behind, and just about managed to hold off Fernando Alonso right at the end on the line. It's literally a matter of inches. And when you consider that result, considering that not really through a majorly his fault incident, he was at the back, to finish P6 and come away with those points at a track he loves is just great. So rating wise for Seb, it's going to be an 8.5, an overall great performance from him. Next up, Mercedes, and to think that they were only the 4th highest scoring team in this one will have to be a bit disappointing for them. Admittedly, their car didn't look that close to the Ferraris and the Red Bulls. I mean, it has consistently been the 3rd quickest, but there's been times where it's been quicker. However, Suzuka didn't look like one, so maybe this is what we should have expected. For George Russell's Japanese Grand Prix, he gained a place early on thanks to Carlos Sainz going off into the barriers, so that was him up from 8th to 7th, which is where he was when we got restarted after the rain delay. Then after that, where he really got unlucky, was Mercedes electing to double stack the cars. So he came in, had to drive slowly, build a bit of a gap, then I think there was a slight delay as well, which meant that he lost a load of places, not only to those people pitting at the same time, but also those that came in maybe a lap before. However, afterwards, on those intermediate tyres, had a really great race. You know, he was dropped down to 13th place with all of those pit stops onto intermediate tyres going on. However, from there, made those overtakes, and a lot of them around the S's, which to be honest I would have thought was one of the trickier places to make overtakes. I think he made 3 maybe, definitely at least 2 of them. So he did really well to fight back up into what was P8, having been overtaken by Alonso. So rating wise for George, I think it's going to be a 7.5. It's a really solid drive. He's lost out through no fault of his own, but then afterwards the overtakes were really good. Now Lewis Hamilton in Japan. Had an okay start, got away fairly well, couldn't make up any positions into the first turn. Managed to get a little switch back on Alonso, who dived up the inside of the hairpin, which I think was pretty crucial for him to stay ahead. Then gained a place when Carlos Sainz went off and was in I think at P5 when all we had the whole rain delay and the red flags. However, afterwards came out was behind Esteban Ocon, and that's where he stayed for the rest of the race. So while it was clear he definitely had good pace, like he had decent pace compared to the Alpines, was definitely quicker, he couldn't get past Ocon, which was the only sort of real thing he had to do in that one. Which means that when I think of a rating for Hamilton, while he had good pace and it was clear to see he wasn't slow, his one major goal was to get into 4th ahead of Ocon, and he couldn't do that. So for a rating for Hamilton, I think it's going to be a 5.5. On the whole, the pace was clearly there, maybe like a 7, but your big task was to get into 4th and you haven't done that, which brings it down. Next up we have Ferrari, and considering that only one car finished the race, again it's another one of those where something just doesn't quite go right for them. Admittedly tricky conditions for Sainz, but still would have been nice for them to have both cars finish, as that pretty much would have been 2 cars in the top 4. As it stands though, they've lost out on the Drivers' Championship with Leclerc now out of it, with Verstappen winning, so yeah, not the best weekend for Ferrari on the whole. So for Sainz's Japanese Grand Prix, it did not last long at all, getting just over half a lap as they exited the hairpin and made their way on the right-hander towards Spoon, where he just sort of caught a river, was aquaplaning, slid off into the barriers, and that was his race done. Was a little bit scary seeing where his car was on track as well, some of the other cars during the race, you know, flying by really quickly straight after the incident. I was kind of tempted to give him a not applicable rating because those conditions were so treacherous early on. However, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, he's the only driver who's actually had a properly big crash. Everyone else has kept it there. I mean, obviously Vettel and Alonso, but that was more of a I didn't see them, had a little incident, whereas Sainz did make a mistake. So rating wise for Sainz, although it's probably quite harsh to do so, I'm going to give him a 3, simply because he has made a mistake and ultimately that has cost him. Now for Charles Leclerc in Japan, and he got a decent start, you know, was alongside and actually ahead of Verstappen, but couldn't make the move stick into turn 1, Max with just too much speed around the outside. Initially seemed to be able to stay with him for that half a lap or so, and they still even started to pull away a bit. Then we had the red flags, and after that, again, seemed to be there just for a little bit at the start, and then his tyres really fell off a cliff, and ended up even being caught by Sergio Perez. And later on, he then made the mistake on the final corner of the final lap, which was the nail in the coffin which handed Verstappen the championship there and then, as he got a 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage or forcing another driver off. It was one of the two. And so while his pace was pretty good, like it was clear he was definitely excelling in the wet conditions, he really wore out those intermediate tyres to the point where he was 20 odd seconds behind Verstappen at the end. And he made that mistake later on, and so ratings wise for Leclerc, I think it's probably going to go down as probably a 6.5. The pace was good, but you throw in the championship ceiling mistake and the rating's got to come down a little. Next up we have Alpine, and after a double DNF in Singapore, they really needed a good result, and that's exactly what they got, with not only 4th place, but also 7th as well, and a good haul of points which elevates them to 4th in the constructors' standings. For Ocon then in the Japanese Grand Prix, overall it was pretty simple actually. He got a decent start, didn't make any positions but didn't lose any either, which meant that later on in the race when we got restarted after all the rain, he was ahead of Lewis Hamilton, and that's exactly where he stayed. He had one job that entire race, which was to keep Lewis Hamilton behind, which is definitely not the easiest of tasks. You know, he was placing that car really well. There were a couple of times into the hairpin, he trusted that outside line that he'd get the better exit, and through 130R, knowing that if he had the inside, even with Hamilton alongside, he'd be able to get through and stay ahead. Down the main straight, he knew he had the straight line speed, and so as long as he got a fairly decent exit, could keep Hamilton behind. So rating wise for Ocon, I think it's going to go down as an 8.5. Obviously, he wasn't quicker than Hamilton, it was clear to see, but he's defended extremely well the entire time and come away with a great result for the team. Now with Alonso, a bit more of a rollercoaster race compared to his teammate. Early on didn't get a great start and had the little incident with Sebastian Vettel. I don't really think that's Alonso's fault, he doesn't change his steering line and you can't see anything down in turn 1. Did go for a move at the hairpin up against Lewis Hamilton, but it didn't quite come off and so he had to settle into 7th place, which became 6th when Sainz went off. Then when we got going again, the team didn't really help him out. They kept him out for quite a while on the wet tyres, which meant that when he pitted, he was dropped down to about 9th place, just ahead of Latifi and behind Vettel. However, while the two of them were on similar age intermediate tyres, Fernando wasn't able to get a move and he wasn't able to get up into 6th place past Sebastian, which meant that later on he boxed for another set of intermediate tyres, which dropped him down again. And so from 10th place in the closing stages of the race was making really good progress, getting past the likes of Norris, Latifi, Russell, and very nearly getting Sebastian Vettel on the finish line. So for Alonso, I think it's going to be an 8, battling through cars not once but twice into a decent finishing position and almost getting P6. It's a pretty good drive on the whole. And then finally Red Bull, who after a penalty to Leclerc just post-race, come away with what is actually a 1-2, but more importantly for them, their man Max Verstappen takes the Drivers' World Championship. I'll have a look at Perez's race, and to begin with, he did jump Carlos Sainz at the start. That was down at turn 1, getting himself up into 3rd place. And obviously that's where he stayed at the restart. However, did drop back a lot from the likes of Leclerc and then Verstappen ahead of him. However, we know how good Checo is at preserving his tyres, and later on that really helped him out, because that gap to Leclerc kept on coming down and down and down, and eventually forced the Monegasque into the mistake, which gave Perez P2 and subsequently Max Verstappen the World Championship there in Japan. However, it must be said he did still finish around 30 seconds almost behind his teammate. So for a rating for Checo, I think I'm going to go with a 7.5. He has made that overtake early on, getting past Sainz. However, the pace compared to Verstappen wasn't great, but he did get Leclerc, so on the whole, you've got to say it's a good performance, but that pace to Verstappen means it's not great. And now Max Verstappen, the world champion at the Japanese Grand Prix 2022, double world champion, and a very good drive to do it. You know, that first corner, throwing it around the outside, showed he meant business, and it was a really great move. You know, no one knows what it's going to be like down into turn 1, but he has that confidence in the car to do so. And then from there, never looked in doubt. At the restart, just slowly started pulling away, and then really started pulling away, almost like a second a lap at one point. And as I said in Perez's segment, finished almost 30 seconds ahead of his teammate. I think it was 27 point something. So when you consider conditions and everything, it really was a deserving drive for a world championship. Rating wise for Verstappen in this one, it's going to be a 9, and the reason it's not a 10, don't get me wrong, his performance was worthy of a 10. However, simply because we only had around 45 minutes of racing, I don't think it's fair to say that someone had a perfect race, considering we just didn't have all those racing laps, but still a great drive on the whole. So there you have the race ratings for Japan then. Max Verstappen sits at the top with a 9. As I mentioned, it would have been a 10. It was worthy of a 10, but I'm not going to give it simply because we only really had half a race. Even though there was full points, that was all very confusing at the end. A number of good drives in there from people like Latifi, who I definitely didn't expect to see. Both Alpines having a good day as well. But then a few not great ones, especially, you know, you look at Carlos Sainz, could have been not applicable, but still did make a mistake. And Pierre Gasly was speeding under the red flag, yellow flag conditions, and as I've mentioned before, the tractor incident, it should not be there in the first place. It's unacceptable for the FIA to be doing that in the first place, and that's the root cause of the incident. Then to the updated standings, and obviously Max Verstappen is at the top, and where he's sealed the championship in real life, he's basically sealed these rankings at this point. It would take a horrific final few races for him to move down. Obviously, the Alpine guys doing very well, they're improving their score. Lewis Hamilton, his goes down a little bit, not the best race on my grading. And then towards the bottom, Nicholas Latifi does improve his score for the first time in quite a while, considering he's had a good race, which no one really saw coming. But anyways, that is all for now, and as mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed and subscribe for more F1 content. Also, please leave me any feedback for this one. I've tried to make it a little bit more upbeat, a little bit more tempo to it, and it's a bit more segmented so that hopefully in future this content can go out in a lot of variations, say YouTube Shorts, maybe a TikTok, something along those lines. But yeah, please leave your thoughts and feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below, but until next time, take care.